Hello, folks. It's a funny thing, really. I ask my followers, do you want more Star Wars content? And they always say no, but then when I do a Star Wars video, it gets a lot of attention. So that's very interesting. I'm curious to see how many of you click on this video. But I wanted to get a little something off my chest, not out of my chest, but off my chest on this whole Star Wars conversation that I only lightly touched on before. But there's been this conversation and this dialogue going on for many, many years now that Star Wars fans are the worst fan base ever. Star Wars fans are the most toxic fan base that can't be pleased with anything, that they overreact to things and they harass actors, and that they are just generally the worst fans you can ever encounter, and that in and of itself is what killed the Star Wars brand and made no one want to be a part of it. And I wanted to explore whether or not that's true, because especially recently, and this is an argument that has popped up a lot these days, is that people argue that anyone who isn't happy with Disney Star Wars is that it's their fault, like it's their pattern of behavior, because very recently, it's been pointed out that George Lucas left Star Wars because he figured no one was happy with his vision of the prequels, so why continue with it? And that is what caused him to sell it off to Disney under the leadership of Kathleen Kennedy in the first place. And the toxic behavior of fans is what caused that, and therefore we have no right to complain about what Star Wars has become. Now, first of all, I want to debunk something from there, because first of all, who are you talking about in terms of Star Wars fans? Because there's a lot of blanket statements being made. Like, I, for example, was a couple months old when The Phantom Menace came out. I know nothing other than growing up loving those films. There's an entire generation, probably the generation that very much dislikes the sequels now, that grew up loving those films and loving George Lucas's vision for it. So you can't just make blanket statements that all Star Wars fans that dislike the sequels, that this is the big zinger against them, that they didn't like Lucas's Star Wars and that's what caused all this, because it's not true. Like, not all of us were against the prequels. Not all of us criticize them. I think that the prequels are very, very flawed, but I still enjoy those films. But going on with the toxic ideas, like just the idea that Star Wars fans are this horrible group, I want to just point out some exaggerations. For example, there's been a lot of lies that are told, and there's lots of lies that get perpetuated about movies. Like when you go to the Dark Knight movies, there's a lot of lies that Heath Ledger never broke character, even though there's literal images and people who were working with him saying that he was just a normal guy when he wasn't doing his Joker scenes. You know, there's there's rumors that Shelley Duvall was greatly mistreated by Stanley Kubrick on the set of The Shining. Like, those are just examples that sometimes rumors around the production or the reception of a film just get spread and get believed. One of those rumors is the idea that Star Wars fans were just so toxic that they destroyed the mental health of Jake Lloyd, and that ruined his life over starring in Star Wars and playing young Anakin Skywalker. But that is actually not true. Is it true that Jake Lloyd behind the scenes left acting and had a lot of mental issues? Yes, that has been documented. However, it was merely an assumption from other people that his mental problems were caused by him starring in the Star Wars prequels. His mother has come out recently and said that his issues that are going on, that they're dealing with, had nothing to do with the Star Wars films and the reception of them. You know, Jake Lloyd has his own separate life. His family has their own separate life and issues, and like any family that they have to deal with apart from Star Wars. It might be shocking, but not everything has to do with Star Wars. It's just that that's the only way that we know these people, so we assume that's what it has to be about. Once again, debunking the kind of lies and rumors that get told and spread about these movies. You know, another lie was spread about The Dark Knight, that it was the Joker and playing the Joker that drove Heath Ledger to unalive himself, and none of that is true. It was not a suicide, it was an accidental overdose, and people who knew Heath Ledger know that he had been having a lot of trouble sleeping, a lot of insomnia. He had been experimenting with drugs to help him sleep, and that is what ultimately led to his death. But because people only know Heath Ledger really through the Dark Knight movie, they associate it with that. Same with Star Wars, same with the prequels, saying that Jake Lloyd's mental health crisis must have been caused by the reaction and the backlash to the prequels, when that's not true. Now, what is true about the backlash to the prequels is, yes, Ahmed Best was lambasted by critics, and yes, at one point he considered taking his life because of how much that affected him and how much that affected his life. And he has an incredible story to tell about how he came back from that. But that also perpetuated the narrative that Star Wars fans are just so toxic that they nearly drove a man to unalive himself. Ahmed Best's story is a good warning to people that they should be careful for exactly how much criticism they lay on a person over a performance. However, there are a couple of elements here with the conversation that I think are unfair. Number one, not all Star Wars fans hated Jar Jar Binks or levied on that much hate. For my personal opinion on Jar Jar, I never hated the character. He was never my favorite character in the entire thing, but I never hated him. I was just always indifferent and fine with him as a kid. And so once again, you can't just levy that on all Star Wars fans there. The other element is that whenever I see the media cover this story, they always say that it purely came from Star Wars fans and the general public to push on so much hate on Ahmed Best, when that is not true at all. Because it was the media that said things like Ahmed Best is perpetuating racist stereotypes with Jar Jar Binks, even though that was not what he was doing at all. He explained in interviews that the voice he was putting on was the voice that he used to do when talking to little kids and reading them books, and he was playing a little kid's character. That's what he was going for. But it was the media that levied on that much abuse for him, and you can see that.
I was called every racial stereotype you can imagine. It was debilitating.
The media themselves, these big publications, laid on a lot of hate for Jar Jar Binks, but somehow now they're getting away with saying that it was just the fans and the general public. And once again, when it comes to the prequels, some people hated it. Some people like me loved George Lucas's work in spite of its flaws and loved what that was doing to the universe. And there was an entire new generation, as evidence from the merchandise, as evidence from people like me, that loved that vision and loved the actors Ewan McGregor, Hayden Christensen, and they still get a lot of praise today. But of course, the other side to that is, yes, there was a lot of hate for the prequels as well. You know, as some of it, I think, was very, very hyperbolic. Some of it went really, really overboard, up calling the prequels the worst thing ever, really, really making fun of the performances from the actors like Hayden Christensen and the silly elements of it. And once again, I think that there is two things to consider, though. One, the reason why Star Wars is going to get more passionate responses, like even hyperbolic responses from that, is because they had a more passionate fan base and because they had such a strong positive impact on people in the first place. Of course, people are going to have more strong reactions when something isn't good, or when something is cringe, or where something is going in a direction that they think is actively making it worse. Like, that's why the reactions to the prequels were so broad and so strong, is because the franchise is literally that big. Star Wars, before The Last Jedi came out, Star Wars was 100% bigger than the MCU. The Force Awakens broke $2 billion, where the MCU had gotten nowhere near that at the time. That was just how big Star Wars was. And when you have a franchise that vast and has that many people that are so passionate about it, of course you're going to have very, very strong opinions. But the last side of this I want to cover regarding the prequels before we get into sequels talk is that, yeah, the prequels were very, very flawed. And even though we can talk about maybe some of the criticisms were exaggerated or hyperbolic, at the same time, people are well within their rights to criticize something, and people are well within their rights to criticize George Lucas as a creative. And listen, it's entirely possible that perhaps the prequels were poorly made as movies and poorly realized as a vision, and the sequels and everything that came after that were very poorly realized, and that people are perfectly valid to criticize them both. The problem with the prequels is that George Lucas was put on such a pedestal for his work with the original Star Wars movies. He was basically given free reign to do whatever he wanted. He didn't have the same restrictions as before. He didn't have the same producers and editors that he had worked with before. And because we didn't get those people reining him in and helping to refine his story, that's why the prequels feel so unfinished, why there's so many plot holes and things like that. And people are well within their rights to criticize that, just like they are now well within their rights to criticize what is happening with the sequels. Because what happened with the sequels? Kathleen Kennedy went forward without a plan. J.J. Abrams went forward without a plan. The Force Awakens, people have a lot to criticize with that film because it's basically just a redo of A New Hope. But all things considered, people were very, very generous to The Force Awakens and Rogue One when they came out and were generally well received, even with all their flaws. But the problem with Disney Star Wars is they didn't have a plan. And then you get to The Last Jedi with this whole subversion thing, and Rian Johnson turning everything in its head, and Kathleen Kennedy assuming that this sort of new age Star Wars she's going to bring about is the way to go forward, and it completely fell upon their faces. And since then, they haven't not known what to do. The Rise of Skywalker aggressively tried to do damage control, but it was too late to fix that story. And then The Mandalorian and all these other Disney Plus shows, generally, they're not good. But when you get to something like The Acolyte that feels like it's generally going against the lore, it's made by people who don't even know Star Wars, it's intentionally trying to antagonize people, it has just awful, awful themes, which we've covered. Yeah, people are well within their rights to criticize this. And yes, when criticism of something is so broad, you're going to get to those people. You're going to get those people who are overly cruel to the actors involved, and they shouldn't be. They should not take it out on the actors for the characters that they were willing to play. But I think that a lot of fans, a lot of their criticisms are being pushed away and swept under the rug by making blanket statements, like assuming that everyone who criticizes the sequels also hated the prequels, or assuming that anybody who criticizes the direction of Star Wars is somebody who's made racist comments against Kelly Marie Tran, which some people did, or some of us just acknowledge she was given awful material to work with and she is not to blame for that. Something that I saw some people pointing out is that they said John Boyega dealt with a lot of hate. I am 100% sure that John Boyega got some hate and even some racism against him for being a black man starring in Star Wars, but some of us think that John Boyega should have been the lead of the sequels, and that would have been an amazing story if they had just charted it from the beginning and given him the big character arc. But he was treated so horribly by those films, made into a clown, never had his full potential realized, and that is really disappointing to us. But in other areas, you get people like Daisy Ridley coming out. Despite all the criticisms against her character of Rey, she came out and said that the Star Wars fan base was not toxic to her after all. And before anyone brings up the recent interview, her words were taken out of context. She pretty much said a similar thing. There's always going to be some people who are actual misogynists out there, but she chooses to focus on the positives. But in the case of Lucasfilm making things like The Acolyte and whatnot, and constantly trying to antagonize the fans, maybe intentionally, yeah, that's gonna get a strong reaction out of people. When you can't right your own ship and people are so passionate about this franchise they don't want to see go down this direction, yeah, you're going to get a lot of passionate, strong reactions. It's a combination of Star Wars having once the most broad, most passionate fan base of all, and that's why it was so successful, and that fan base being whittled down and destroyed, and that's why you get these reactions. But the problem with this whole thing about blaming Star Wars fans about being the worst, most toxic, most awful fan base in the world is it's constantly ignoring the accountability of the creatives working behind the scenes. Like, maybe George Lucas deserves a little bit of accountability for taking so much control over the prequels, for not letting anyone else have a say in it, and having so many mistakes in it because of that. Maybe it is Kathleen Kennedy's fault for not charting out a proper course for what the Star Wars sequels would be, and what the next movies following that would be, and what the Disney Plus shows would be. That is on her. It is on her for continuing to allow people like Leslie Headland to get involved and want to subvert the Star Wars Wars mythos and do things that they know is going to upset people, and just generally make awful content and say things intentionally to antagonize the fans and then say that they are the toxic ones. Star Wars is not the worst fan base on planet Earth. It is filled with a lot of passionate fans who want to love this universe, even with all of its flaws. Star Wars just has a lot of bad creative people working behind the scenes on it now. Like, to compare with Marvel or Pixar right now, they are doing things to try to right the ship and give fans the characters they want. But with Star Wars, we're still not seeing that. We're still seeing them hold on to the idea that they will overthrow this old fan base and get a new one, and it's not working. They really seem to disdain the old fan base. And like, that is the real toxicity. And it's the real toxicity when you're telling people that they're not allowed to criticize. There are things you can do to de-escalate the conversation when you acknowledge how fans are feeling. However, that is not what the people at Lucasfilm have done. They've just done things to antagonize it and continuously blame fans for not liking what they're doing or becoming angry. But the real fear is not angry fans, but apathetic fans. Once again, will this video pick up? I don't know. People have liked my Star Wars videos before, but we'll see. I'm seeing more and more fans just generally becoming apathetic towards Star Wars, and it's not reaching new generations because who wants to become a part of this new universe that isn't having any good content, and all of the discussion around it is just arguing from the fans who don't want Star Wars to go in this direction, and from the new fans who insist that they have to like this, or that they're not really fans, or that they're just toxic. So no, in conclusion, the Star Wars fan base is not the most toxic fan base ever. It just has really awful luck with the people who are in charge of it behind the scenes that keep causing all of this discussion. Even Marvel, getting the original people to do Daredevil Born Again. There are examples of Marvel trying to right the ship, bringing back Hugh Jackman, bring back things people like, and trying to move forward there. And there is examples of them at the very least trying to do that, but that's not Lucasfilm. That's not what Lucasfilm is doing, and they have no one to blame but for themselves for the disinterest that is happening to Star Wars and the arguing and the toxic conversation around it. But that is all I got for you guys today. Thank you to the 14 patrons who are supporting this channel. I do everything on this myself, from the writing to recording to editing. So if you would like to support me on Patreon, please check out the link in the description, and I will see you guys next time.